An Apache woman on sail faced the crowd. One cowboy changed her fate forever. The sun rose high over the small frontier town, beating down on the dusty streets with a fierce intensity. Merchants were already shouting their wares. Horses whinnied in the stable yards, and the smell of leather, sweat, and dust filled the air. It was the kind of morning where every sound felt sharper, every shadow more pronounced. People were busy preparing for another ordinary day, unaware that today would be marked by something extraordinary and terrible at the same time. In the center of the town, a group of men dragged a young Apache woman forward. Her hands were tied with coarse ropes, and her feet moved stiffly on the rough ground. Despite her situation, her head remained high, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with a calm that seemed almost impossible given her circumstances. Her name was Nayeli. She was known among her people for her courage and intelligence, and even now, in the midst of fear and confusion, those qualities shone through. The square where she was brought was surrounded by wooden shops, the small jail, and a saloon at the far end. Townspeople began to gather, curiosity drawing them closer. They whispered to one another, some expressing excitement, others mild disgust, but all with the same undeniable interest. Nayeli could hear their words, but she focused in steadying her own breath. She had faced danger before, but being presented as property to a crowd was a new and humiliating ordeal. Yet, she refused to show fear. Among the crowd stood a man apart from the others. He was tall and lean, dressed in the worn clothes of a traveler, a cowboy hat shading his eyes from the blazing sun. His name was Caleb. Unlike the others who were jostling and pointing, he stood quietly, watching Nayeli with careful attention. There was something in her eyes that caught his attention immediately. Not just fear, but strength, pride, and intelligence. He felt a pull, a sense that this young woman's fate was unfair and that he might be able to do something to change it. The auctioneer began his work, a man with a loud, grating voice that carried across the square. He called out Nayeli's supposed price as if she were a piece of livestock rather than a human being with thoughts, feelings, and dreams. The townspeople responded eagerly, shouting their bids, competing for the right to claim her. Nayeli's heart pounded, but she did not cry out or struggle. She remembered the stories her grandmother had told her about bravery, about keeping one's dignity even in the darkest moments. She drew strength from those memories. Caleb's eyes narrowed as he listened to the men argue. Some shouted in greed, seeing her only as an opportunity for profit. Others seemed almost indifferent, treating her as a thing to be examined for amusement. Caleb could feel anger rising within him, but he forced himself to stay calm. Any rash action could make the situation worse. Instead, he began to consider carefully how he might intervene without causing a dangerous scene. He noticed the expressions on Nayeli's face. There was no pleading, no begging, only a quiet, steady defiance. It was as if she were telling the world, without words, that she was more than a price tag. That silent courage struck Caleb more than any speech could. He understood that rushing in with violence would not honor her strength, and it might even put her at risk. He needed a plan, a way to help that did not compromise her dignity or safety. The auctioneer raised his voice, calling for higher bids. Nayeli's stomach tightened as she heard men arguing over her future. Every offer made her pulse race. Every shout made her fear grow. Yet she refused to show it. She reminded herself that she had survived harsh winters, dangerous trails, and threats from those who sought to harm her. She had survived before, and she would survive now. Caleb moved a little closer, blending in with the crowd while still keeping his eyes on Nayeli. He spoke quietly to himself, thinking through the situation. He understood the laws of the town and the risks involved. If he acted too openly, he could be attacked or arrested. If he waited too long, the deal might be completed, and Nayeli would be lost to him. He had to find the perfect moment to act, a moment that would create an opportunity without endangering either of them. Nayeli, meanwhile, focused on the small details around her. She noticed a loose board in the fence nearby, the way the sun glinted off a window at the far end of the square, and the uneven stones under her feet. Her mind worked quickly, calculating what she might be able to do if the chance arose. She had been trained to survive, to move quickly and think on her feet. She did not expect a rescue, but she prepared herself just in case. The crowd's energy grew more intense. Some men tried to leer at her or make rude comments, but Nayeli ignored them, holding herself with the calm grace of someone who knew her worth. She caught sight of a few children in the crowd, watching with wide eyes. She smiled faintly at them, a small act of defiance and hope. Even in the midst of fear, she could inspire courage in others. Caleb saw that smile and felt a renewed sense of urgency. He realized that Nayeli's dignity, her inner strength, was as important as her safety. He could not let her be sold to those who would treat her as less than human. He began speaking quietly to the auctioneer, asking questions about the legality of the sale. The auctioneer, momentarily distracted, turned to respond, giving Caleb a few precious seconds to think through his next move. Nayeli noticed the change in the auctioneer's attention. She sensed that something unusual was happening, though she did not yet understand it. The crowd was still pressing in, voices loud, but there was a slight pause, a hesitation that gave her a small measure of relief. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm her racing heart. Perhaps, just perhaps, this stranger might be more than he appeared.
Caleb continued to maneuver carefully.
He addressed the auctioneer with respect but firmness, hinting at rewards that could come from releasing Nayeli rather than selling her to the highest bidder. The auctioneer was skeptical, unsure if this man was serious or just trying to cause trouble. The crowd murmured, sensing tension in the air. Nayeli felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark that maybe her fate could change. Throughout it all, Nayeli held herself with courage. She did not lower her gaze or falter in her posture. She had faced harsh winters, dangerous landscapes, and threats from hostile forces, and she had survived. Now, in the middle of a crowded town square, her survival depended on her calmness and her ability to read the situation. She met Caleb's eyes for a brief moment, silently acknowledging the presence of an ally. In that instant, a bond formed, a silent understanding that he might be the person who could change everything. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the square, Nayeli stood tall. The ropes on her wrists chafed, her feet ached, and the heat pressed down upon her, but she refused to bend. Around her, the crowd shouted, pushed, and speculated, but she remained steadfast. Every muscle in her body was tense with anticipation, yet controlled. G had learned that fear could be a tool if managed wisely. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. Caleb, meanwhile, kept his focus, aware that every second counted. He could feel the eyes of the town upon him, some curious, some hostile. He knew that a wrong word, a misstep, could ruin everything. Yet he also knew that action was necessary, that the longer he waited, the more likely Nayeli would be lost to those who saw her only as property. His mind raced, calculating possibilities, imagining outcomes, weighing risks, and yet he felt no hesitation in his heart. This was right. This was necessary. Nayeli, sensing his intent, felt a strange mixture of hope and caution. She had been betrayed before, left in danger by those she trusted. Yet there was something different about this man. His gaze did not waver, his stance was steady, and his voice, when he spoke, carried respect rather than dominance. For the first time in a long while, she felt a small seed of trust. The auctioneer raised his voice again, calling for the next bid. Nayeli's pulse quickened, but she did not flinch. She met each gaze with quiet confidence, silently daring anyone to underestimate her. Caleb, noticing the rising tension, stepped slightly forward, preparing to act at just the right moment. The sun blazed down on the square, shadows shifted, and the murmur of the crowd became a dull roar. Yet amid it all, Nayeli's calm defiance remained, a quiet flame in the midst of chaos. Time seemed to stretch as the bidding continued. Nayeli focused on each detail: the angle of the sun, the movement of the crowd, the sound of the auctioneer's voice. She prepared herself mentally, imagining the steps she might take if an opportunity arose. She did not yet know what Caleb planned, but she could feel that something significant was about to happen. Her courage remained intact, a silent promise to herself that no one could take away her dignity. no matter the outcome. And there in the middle of the crowd, two lives began to intertwine. Hers, a young woman facing the cruel uncertainty of the world, and his, a cowboy determined to intervene and make a difference. The day had only begun, but the first moments of change were already unfolding. Nayeli and Caleb both knew in their own way that whatever happened next could alter the course of their lives forever. The bidding continued, louder and more chaotic now as the crowd pressed closer to see the young Apache woman Nayeli, whose calm courage seemed to challenge the entire town. Men shouted over each other, waving their hands and calling out higher sums of money, each intent on claiming her as if she were a mere object to trade. Some laughed, some jeered, and some merely watched with curiosity, unaware of the human heart beating beneath her bound wrists. Nayeli felt the weight of every gaze, every whispered comment, and yet she did not bow her head. Her pride and spirit were her armor, and she held on to them tightly. Caleb remained near the edge of the crowd, his eyes fixed on Nayeli. He had noticed the different reactions of the townspeople, the ones who treated her cruelly, the ones who watched passively, and the few who seemed uneasy at the injustice of it all. He realized that the key to helping her would not be brute force. Any sudden action could provoke the crowd and put both of them in danger. Instead, he began thinking carefully, looking for a way to turn the situation to their advantage. As the auctioneer called for the next bid, Nayeli's stomach tightened. Each shout of money felt like another chain around her freedom. She had been through hardships before, the long marches across the plains, the harsh winters with little food, and dangerous encounters with enemies. But none of those trials had been like this. She was surrounded by a crowd that saw her not as a person, but as a prize, and that made her feel vulnerable in a way she had never known. Yet beneath the fear, a quiet resolve burned. She would not let despair take hold. She would survive, one way or another. Caleb observed the auctioneer closely. The man was skilled at keeping control of the crowd, but there were moments when he faltered, moments when Caleb could intervene without causing chaos. Caleb began to speak to him, quietly at first, asking about the legality of selling a human being in this town. His questions were measured, polite, yet firm, creating a pause in the crowd's excitement. People turned their heads, curious about the sudden tension in the auction. Nayeli noticed Caleb's presence and felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this man was different from the others. The auctioneer frowned, uncertain how to respond. His booming voice faltered slightly as he explained that the sale was regal under the town's rules, but Caleb was not satisfied. He pressed further, pointing out loopholes and questioning whether the deal could truly stand without consequences. The crowd began to murmur, sensing a new element in the day's proceedings. Nayeli's heart pounded with cautious anticipation. Could this stranger really challenge the system and offer her a way out?
Among the townspeople, a few men began to grow restless.
They had come to see her sold, not rescued. One man shouted at Caleb, demanding that he stop interfering. Another laughed derisively, calling him a fool. Caleb ignored them, his focus entirely on Nayeli and the auctioneer. He knew that words alone might not be enough, but they could create an opening, a moment where he could act without provoking violence. He had to be clever, patient, and precise. Nayeli shifted slightly, feeling the ropes chafe against her wrists. She could hear the murmurs of the crowd, the excitement, the tension, and the fear. Yet she reminded herself to remain calm. Her people had taught her to face danger with a steady heart, to observe carefully, and to act only when the right moment came. She watched Caleb as well, noting the way he spoke with determination and respect. In him she saw the possibility of change, of someone willing to act for justice rather than profit. The crowd's energy was rising again. Another bidder shouted, waving his hand, offering an even larger sum. Nayeli's stomach sank slightly, but she did not panic. She had learned long ago that fear could be controlled, that panic could be dangerous. She focused on her breathing, keeping her mind sharp, watching for any opportunity that might appear. She noticed small details, the uneven stones of the square, the loose planks in the fence, the way the sunlight reflected off nearby buildings. Every detail could matter if she needed to act. Caleb realized that Nayeli's awareness was extraordinary. He had seen many people in difficult situations, but few maintained such clarity and courage under pressure. He began to feel admiration for her, a quiet respect that went beyond mere sympathy. She was not helpless, she was strong, and he needed to work with her strength, not against it. He leaned slightly closer to the auctioneer, proposing a compromise. If Nayeli were released rather than sold, he offered, the seller could gain a larger reward later through other means. The auctioneer looked skeptical. The crowd murmured, sensing tension but not fully understanding it. Caleb's voice was calm, persuasive, and firm. He continued to negotiate, careful not to antagonize the men around him. Nayeli, meanwhile, sensed a shift in energy. Something was changing. The tension in the air was different now, not just fear, but anticipation. Perhaps, she thought, change was possible. Perhaps she might not be sold after all. A few of the townspeople began to whisper among themselves. Some expressed doubt about the auctioneer's control. Others wondered if Caleb was simply bluffing. Nayeli felt the smallest spark of hope flicker in her chest. She did not yet celebrate. She knew better than to rely on uncertain outcomes. But the possibility that she could escape the auction, even slightly, gave her courage. She reminded herself to stay ready, to observe, to act if needed. Caleb noticed a few men in the crowd whose expressions suggested they might interfere. He adjusted his approach, speaking louder now, making sure his words carried authority. He offered respect to the auctioneer while implying that legal consequences could follow if the sale continued. The auctioneer looked uncomfortable, glancing at the crowd, unsure whether to continue or pause. Nayeli felt her pulse quicken. This was the moment when courage and timing mattered most. The auctioneer finally paused. The shouting stopped for a brief moment, replaced by murmurs of curiosity and suspicion. Nayeli's heart leapt slightly. She watched Caleb carefully, noting the confidence in his movements and the careful strategy in his words. He was creating an opportunity, a chance for her freedom. But it was still uncertain. The crowd was unpredictable, and one wrong move could ruin everything. She stayed alert, ready to follow his lead if the moment came. A man in the crowd tried to make a rude comment toward Nayeli, but she ignored him completely. Her calm defiance angered some and confused others. Caleb noticed the interaction and stepped slightly closer, signaling that he would not allow disrespect. His presence alone seemed to calm some of the more aggressive men, while others simply watched in surprise at his courage. Nayeli felt a quiet sense of reassurance. She realized that Caleb's actions were not reckless. He was thinking, observing, and protecting her in subtle ways. Time stretched, every second feeling heavier under the hot sun. Nayeli focused on each movement in the crowd, each word from the auctioneer and each gesture from Caleb. She began to recognize patterns, noticing which men were likely to act impulsively and which would hesitate. She felt a small surge of confidence. Even in a situation where she was powerless in appearance, she still had control over her mind and her reactions. Caleb, too, observed Nayeli's reactions. He realized that she was not just waiting to be saved, she was actively participating in her own defense. Her eyes scanned, her body remained poised, and her mind worked rapidly to assess the situation. He felt admiration and respect for her courage, knowing that any rescue would require her cooperation and trust. He had to act wisely, ensuring her dignity remained intact. The crowd began to shift again. Some men whispered to one another, unsure whether to continue bidding or wait. The auctioneer hesitated, clearly weighing Caleb's arguments. Nayeli felt her hope rise cautiously, like a small flame flickering in the wind. She knew the path ahead was uncertain, but she also knew that courage and careful planning could change outcomes. For the first time since the auction began, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility of freedom. Caleb noticed a small opening, a chance to press the auctioneer further. He spoke with a calm authority, offering a solution that could benefit both the seller and Nayeli. His words were persuasive, backed by logic and the subtle implication of reward. The auctioneer looked at him with a mixture of doubt and curiosity. Nayeli held her breath, knowing that the next few moments could decide everything. Amid the rising tension, Naeli felt a small spark of trust in Caleb. She realized that his presence was more than mere coincidence. He had seen injustice, recognized it, and was willing to act. For the first time in hours, she felt a flicker of hope. Not blind hope, but cautious, aware hope. She prepared herself mentally to follow any opportunity he created, ready to act when the time came. The sun continued to climb, shadows shifting across the square. The crowd's murmurs grew louder again, but there was a sense of uncertainty now. Naeli sensed that the tide might be turning. She stood tall, her hands bound, but her spirit unbroken. Caleb, observing her strength, knew that success depended not just on his actions, but on respecting her courage and timing. Together, silently, they began to move toward a small possibility of freedom, a chance to change what seemed inevitable. The tension in the town square had reached a point where even the busiest townspeople could feel it pressing on their shoulders. The auctioneer paused again, scratching his head and muttering under his breath. The crowd grew restless, uncertain whether the sale would continue or dissolve into confusion. Naeli, standing in the center with her wrists still bound, felt a mixture of hope and caution. She knew that the slightest misstep could change everything in an instant. But she also sensed that Caleb, the quiet man who had been watching her so carefully, was about to take the first decisive step. Caleb spoke again to the auctioneer, his voice calm but commanding. He outlined a plan, carefully explaining how releasing Naeli now could benefit the seller more than completing the sale. He promised a future reward, a secure deal that would come without the risk of legal trouble or social backlash. The auctioneer frowned, skeptical but intrigued. He had never encountered a situation like this, and the possibility of a greater gain made him pause. Caleb's words were precise, his tone persuasive, and his timing perfect. The crowd, sensing the unusual negotiation, began to quiet down, curious to see how this drama would unfold. Naeli noticed every detail of Caleb's actions. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere as the auctioneer considered Caleb's offer. She had learned long ago to read people and situations quickly. The slight hesitation in the auctioneer's voice, the way some of the crowd leaned forward in curiosity, and the nervous glance of a few men all suggested that a small opening had appeared. Naeli's mind raced. This was the moment when courage and preparation would be tested. She focused on her breathing, keeping her heart steady, and prepared to act if necessary. Caleb could sense Naeli's readiness. He had watched her throughout the morning, noting how her calm defiance had influenced the crowd. She had not cried out, she had not begged, and yet her presence alone commanded attention. He realized that any plan to help her escape had to involve her cooperation. He could not force her to act. He could only guide, support, and create opportunity. He leaned slightly closer to the auctioneer, lowering his voice so only the man could hear. He proposed a new approach, one that would give the appearance of a legitimate transaction while allowing Naeli a chance to step away from danger. The auctioneer's eyes narrowed as he considered Caleb's proposal. He glanced at Naeli, who remained standing tall, her head high despite the ropes that bound her wrists. He could not help but notice her calm, poised demeanor. Caleb continued to speak, pointing out the advantages of his plan with careful reasoning. The crowd watched in anticipation, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. The murmurs grew softer, the shuffling of feet slowed, and a strange silence began to fall over the square. Naeli felt a spark of cautious hope. For hours, she had faced fear, uncertainty, and the judgment of strangers. She had endured the humiliation of being auctioned like property, yet she had never lost her sense of self. Now she sensed a small opening, a chance to reclaim her freedom. She watched Caleb carefully, reading his eyes and body language. He was patient, calculating, and respectful. She felt a quiet trust begin to grow. Perhaps the stranger could truly help her escape the fate the auction had threatened. Caleb knew the moment required careful timing. He could not act too quickly, or the auctioneer and the crowd might react violently. He also could not wait too long, or the moment might pass and Naeli could be sold to the highest bidder. He began speaking to the auctioneer with a mix of firmness and subtle charm. using words that emphasized opportunity and caution. His voice carried authority, and his confidence seemed to calm some of the more aggressive men in the crowd. Nayeli felt a small sense of reassurance. She realized that Caleb's strategy was not reckless, it was deliberate and thoughtful. As Caleb negotiated, he noticed a group of men in the crowd who seemed poised to intervene if the sale continued. He adjusted his approach, speaking with louder clarity so that the auctioneer's attention remained focused on him rather than the crowd. He emphasized the benefits of releasing Nayeli, painting a picture of safety, future gain, and legal security. The auctioneer, still skeptical, finally nodded slightly, considering the proposal seriously. The crowd murmured, sensing a turning point in the day's events. Nayeli's heart beat faster as she watched the subtle shifts in the auctioneer's expression. She had survived harsh winters, treacherous terrain, and dangerous encounters, but this challenge felt different. Her freedom, her dignity, depended on another person's willingness to act. Yet, she had learned to remain calm, to observe, and to act when the moment presented itself. She adjusted her stance slightly, ready to move at a signal, trusting Caleb to guide her. Caleb sensed her readiness and felt a surge of determination. He could not allow fear, doubt, or hesitation to undermine the moment. He continued to negotiate, carefully emphasizing the practicality and benefit of releasing Nayeli. He spoke in a calm, steady voice, making sure the auctioneer understood that this approach was the safest and most advantageous for everyone involved. The auctioneer, clearly weighing the options, paused again, his attention focused entirely on Caleb. The crowd fell silent, sensing the drama unfolding before them. Nayeli felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. For hours, she had endured the weight of the crowd's gaze, the tension of being sold, and the uncertainty of her fate. Now she felt a small but growing hope that she might escape. She focused on staying calm, keeping her mind sharp, and watching Caleb for guidance. Every movement he made, every word he spoke, was a signal for what might come next. She had learned that courage alone was not enough. Timing, observation, and preparation were equally important. Caleb noticed a slight change in the auctioneer's posture. The man seemed ready to concede, to allow Nayeli's release under Caleb's conditions. Caleb knew that he had to act now while the opportunity existed. He continued to speak, making the proposal sound reasonable and attractive, highlighting both immediate and long-term benefits. Nayeli, sensing the subtle shift, prepared herself to move. She remained poised, her mind focused, her spirit steady. The crowd began to lean forward, curious and confused by the unusual proceedings. Men who had shouted the highest bids now watched in uncertainty. Some whispered among themselves, questioning whether the sale would continue or be halted. Nayeli could hear snippets of conversation, but she did not allow them to distract her. She focused entirely on Caleb and the auctioneer, understanding that the next moments would determine the course of her life. Caleb recognized the subtle cues of the crowd and used them to his advantage. He emphasized the logic and fairness of releasing Nayeli, creating a sense of inevitability that the auctioneer could not easily resist. The auctioneer, now clearly considering the proposal, glanced at Nayeli and then back at Caleb. The crowd waited in tense silence, sensing that the turning point had arrived. Nayeli's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. She knew that hope must be tempered with caution until the opportunity was fully secured. Finally, after several tense minutes, the auctioneer gave a small nod. Caleb's careful negotiation had worked. Nayeli could see the slight change in the crowd's energy. Some seemed relieved, some frustrated, and some curious. For the first time since the auction began, she allowed herself a quiet smile, a small acknowledgement that freedom might soon be within reach. Caleb turned slightly toward Nayeli, giving her a subtle signal. She understood immediately. The time to act was coming. She adjusted her stance, ready to follow his lead. Every detail she had observed, the crowd's movements, the auctioneer's expressions, the positioning of men around the square, would guide her next steps. She felt a combination of relief, determination, and cautious hope. Caleb moved closer, speaking quietly to Nayeli so that only she could hear. He instructed her on the next step, explaining how she should respond and when to act. Nayeli nodded slightly, understanding the plan. She had learned that survival depended not just on courage but on trust and precise action. Caleb's careful guidance combined with her own readiness created a small but significant opportunity. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the square, the crowd remained unaware of the delicate plan unfolding before them. Nayeli focused entirely on Caleb's instructions, keeping her mind sharp and her body ready. The ropes that bound her wrist were still uncomfortable, but they no longer felt like a prison. Instead, they were a challenge to be overcome, a test of courage and timing. Caleb could feel the weight of the moment. Every eye in the crowd, every whisper, every subtle movement mattered. He continued to negotiate with the auctioneer, maintaining a calm authority and creating space for Nayeli to act when the time came. The auctioneer, sensing both risk and potential gain, remained focused on Caleb, giving the pair a critical advantage. Nayeli felt a mixture of tension and hope, understanding that the next few moments would determine her fate. Finally, the auctioneer stepped back slightly, a clear sign that he had agreed to Caleb's conditions. Nayeli felt a surge of relief, tempered by caution. She knew that freedom was within reach, but she also knew that the crowd could react unpredictably. She remained poised, ready to move, trusting Caleb's guidance. The air in the square seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next action that would decide the outcome. Caleb gave a final quiet signal to Nayeli. She nodded slightly, understanding the exact moment to follow his lead. The plan was clear. Step carefully, maintain dignity, and move toward safety. Every step mattered. Every movement had to be precise. Nayeli's heart raced, but her calm focus never wavered. The turning point had arrived, and the two of them were ready to act together. The moment had arrived. The auctioneer's hesitant nod had given Caleb and Nayeli the opening they needed. For hours the sun had blazed overhead, casting long shadows across the town square, and now the heat seemed to intensify the tension in the air. Nayeli's heart pounded fiercely, but she held herself steady. She knew that courage alone would not carry her through. Timing, focus, and trust in Caleb were just as important. Caleb leaned slightly closer, his voice low and deliberate, so only Nayeli could hear. "When I signal, move quickly, but calmly. Keep your head high, walk with confidence, and follow me. Don't panic, no matter what happens." Nayeli nodded subtly, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. There was a silent understanding between them, a shared determination that neither words nor fear could break. The auctioneer stepped back, distracted by Caleb's negotiation. In that brief pause, Caleb gestured subtly to Nayeli. She shifted her weight, moving her feet carefully so the ropes on her wrists would not tangle. Her breathing remained even, though her pulse raced. Every sound, the murmur of the crowd, the shuffle of boots, the distant clatter of horse hooves, was sharp in her mind. She focused on each detail, aware that any hesitation could ruin the plan. Caleb took the first step. He moved confidently toward the auctioneer, speaking in measured tones about the benefits of the agreement. His presence alone commanded attention, and the crowd, sensing the unusual circumstances, quieted down slightly. Nayeli followed his lead, stepping forward in a controlled, graceful manner. Her body felt tense, but her mind was clear. She reminded herself of her training, her experiences in the wild, and the resilience that had carried her through danger before. A few men in the crowd muttered under their breath, noticing the pair moving together. Some grew suspicious, shifting uneasily. Caleb noticed these movements and adjusted his posture, maintaining a calm authority that discouraged interference. Nayeli mirrored his composure, walking steadily, her eyes scanning the square for potential obstacles. The ropes on her wrists pressed against her skin, but she did not flinch. She understood that fear could make her stumble, but composure would guide her to safety. As they approached the edge of the crowd, a man stepped forward, attempting to intervene. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded, his voice loud enough to draw attention. Caleb stopped briefly, his gaze firm but non-confrontational. "We're following the agreement," he said evenly. "She is being released as discussed." The man hesitated, clearly taken aback by Caleb's calm tone. Nayeli felt a flicker of relief. Every second of hesitation gave them a greater chance of moving past the crowd safely. The auctioneer, seeing the interaction, took a step back. He seemed uncertain now, caught between the logic of Caleb's argument and the murmuring of the townspeople. Caleb continued to speak, emphasizing fairness and legality, giving the impression that everything was proceeding correctly. The subtle authority in his voice created a window of opportunity, and Nayeli seized it. She took another careful step, feeling the rough cobblestones beneath her feet and the weight of the ropes on her wrists. The crowd's attention was partially on Caleb and partially on the auctioneer, which allowed Nayeli to navigate through the confusion. She moved steadily, her posture upright, her eyes forward. Every movement was deliberate, every breath controlled. She noticed small details: the direction of a horse tied nearby, the position of a loose plank on a fence, and the angle of the sun as it reflected off the buildings. Each detail mattered, providing guidance for her next step. Caleb kept one eye on Nayeli and the other on the crowd. He recognized the tension building in the townspeople. Some were curious, some suspicious, and a few were openly angry at being denied the sale they expected. He used every ounce of his presence and authority to maintain calm, speaking to those who approached with a steady voice and a confident stance. Nayeli felt reassured by his strategy. She realized that he was not just strong, he was clever, understanding the psychology of the crowd and using it to their advantage. Step by step, they moved closer to the edge of the square. Nayeli's heart raced, but she stayed composed, focusing on the path ahead rather than the chaos behind her. The ropes on her wrists had started to rub against her skin, causing discomfort, but she ignored it. Her mind remained sharp, aware of every sound, every glance, every movement. She knew that the smallest mistake could change everything, but she trusted Caleb's guidance completely. A few townspeople began to murmur louder, realizing that something unusual was happening. "Wait a minute!" one man shouted, pointing toward Nayeli. Another tried to step forward, but Caleb's calm authority and confident stance discouraged further interference. He spoke firmly, his voice carrying over the crowd. "She is free to leave, as agreed. There is no need for conflict." The clarity and confidence in his tone created a moment of hesitation among the men, giving Nayeli the chance to continue moving forward. As they neared the edge of the square, Caleb signaled subtly to Nayeli. She understood immediately. It was time to accelerate, to move past the final obstacles with poise and determination. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and stepped briskly but gracefully, her eyes focused on the open street ahead. The crowd, still unsure of what to do, parted slightly, giving her a narrow but sufficient path. Once they were past the immediate cluster of townspeople, Caleb guided Nayeli toward the stables where their horses were tied. The rhythmic clatter of hooves and the occasional snort of the animals provided a familiar, reassuring background. Nayeli approached cautiously, aware of the need to mount quickly but carefully. Caleb helped guide her, keeping one hand near her shoulder to steady her balance without being overbearing. The moment she mounted the horse, Nayeli felt a surge of relief and exhilaration. The ropes on her wrists still bound her, but the movement gave her a sense of momentum, a sense of control returning to her body. Caleb followed closely, mounting his horse with practiced ease. Together they began moving slowly at first, ensuring that the crowd would not attempt a sudden confrontation. Each step brought them closer to freedom, each movement reinforcing the sense that the plan had worked. The open plains beyond the town square beckoned, vast and stretching toward the horizon. Nayeli felt the wind on her face, a refreshing contrast to the heat and tension of the square. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper possibility, hope, and a future she had not dared to imagine until now. Caleb guided the horse carefully, maintaining a steady pace while keeping an eye on the town behind them. Nayeli followed his lead, learning to trust the rhythm of the ride and the steady guidance of her companion. As they moved further from the town, the sounds of the square faded. The shouting, the murmurs, and the chaotic energy of the auction gave way to the steady clip-clop of hooves against the dirt path and the gentle rustle of grass in the wind. Nayeli felt her body relax slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing. She had faced danger, uncertainty, and fear, and she had survived. For the first time in hours, or perhaps days, She felt a small measure of true safety. Caleb glanced at her, noting the change in her posture, the subtle relaxation in her expression. He felt a quiet pride and relief. They were not yet entirely safe, but the immediate danger of the auction had passed. He spoke softly, reassuringly. "We're not far from a place where you can rest safely. Stay alert, but take comfort. You've done well." Nayeli nodded, grateful for both his guidance and his respect. She realized that freedom was not just about leaving the town. It was about finding someone who would treat her with dignity and help her navigate the dangers of the world. The journey across the plains was long and careful. They rode side by side, maintaining a pace that allowed them to stay alert while covering ground efficiently. Nayeli's mind raced, recalling the events of the day: the auction, the crowd, the negotiation, and the subtle signals that had guided her to safety. She reflected on her own courage and resilience, understanding that she had played an active role in her escape. Caleb's help had been crucial, but her own awareness and determination had been equally important. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange, Nayeli felt a sense of hope that had been absent for so long. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time she believed in the possibility of safety. She looked to Caleb, who returned her gaze with quiet understanding. They did not speak much, for words were unnecessary. The trust and shared experience between them spoke louder than any conversation could. Hours passed as they continued riding, the landscape shifting from dusty plains to rolling hills and scattered groves of trees. Nayeli felt the tension gradually drain from her body, replaced by a cautious optimism. Each mile they put between themselves and the town was a mile toward freedom. She allowed herself a small private smile, acknowledging the remarkable turn of events and the courage it had taken to navigate them. By the time darkness began to settle over the land, they reached a safe location, a secluded grove with a small stream and natural cover. Here they could rest, regroup, and plan their next steps. Nayeli dismounted, stretching her sore muscles and taking in the peaceful surroundings. The ropes were loosened, but the lessons of the day lingered in her mind. Courage, observation, patience, and trust had all been essential in surviving and escaping the auction. Caleb tended to their horses while keeping an eye on the surrounding area. He had learned long ago that even moments of apparent safety required vigilance. Nayeli, meanwhile, allowed herself to finally breathe deeply, feeling the weight of fear and tension begin to lift. She realized that the day's events had not only tested her courage but also revealed the kindness, intelligence, and bravery of someone willing to act for justice. As they settled near the stream, Nayeli spoke softly, her voice steady but tinged with relief. "I thought I would never escape. Today, you saved me." Caleb shook his head slightly, a modest smile crossing his face. "I didn't save you. You helped save yourself. I just guided the way." Nayeli nodded, understanding the truth in his words. Her own strength had been essential, and Caleb's role had been that of guidance, protection, and support. Night fell and the stars appeared overhead, twinkling in the clear, dark sky. Nayeli and Caleb sat quietly near the stream, reflecting on the day's events and the journey ahead. They had survived the auction, navigated danger, and found safety, for now. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight was a moment of peace, a moment to honor courage, resilience, and the power of careful, deliberate action. The night was calm, the stars twinkling softly above the open plains, as Nayeli and Caleb rested near the small stream. The journey from the town had been tense, exhausting, and filled with uncertainty. Yet here, under the vast sky, a quiet sense of relief settled over them. The dangers of the auction square were behind them, replaced by the stillness of nature and the gentle sounds of water flowing over smooth stones. For the first time in days, Nayeli felt her body and mind begin to relax. She thought about the events that had brought her here, the humiliation of being sold, the crowd's cruel eyes, and the rising panic that had threatened to overtake her. Yet she had endured it all, drawing on her courage, her intelligence, and her awareness of every detail. But most of all, she thought of Caleb, the cowboy who had observed, waited, and acted at exactly the right moment. Without his guidance, she knew the escape might never have been possible. And still, she also knew that it had been her own determination that allowed her to seize the opportunity when it appeared. Caleb sat a little apart, tending to the horses while keeping a watchful eye on the surrounding area. The soft rustle of leaves and the gentle flow of the stream created a soothing rhythm that contrasted sharply with the chaos they had escaped. He glanced at Naili, noticing the tension slowly leaving her shoulders and the faint relief in her eyes. Though they had only recently met, a quiet bond had formed between them, a bond built on trust, shared courage, and the understanding that both had faced danger. "And tomorrow we'll need to find a safe place for longer-term shelter," Caleb said quietly, breaking the silence. "Somewhere you can rest without worry, and somewhere you can decide what comes next." Nayeli nodded, appreciating his words. It was a promise of continuity, of safety, and most importantly, of choice. For hours, she had been stripped of agency, her future dictated by strangers who saw her as property. Now, for the first time, she had a say in her own path. The fire of determination within her burned brightly. She realized that freedom was not just about escaping the auction. It was about taking control of her life, reclaiming her voice, and making choices that reflected who she truly was. She looked toward Caleb, grateful not just for his help, but for the respect he had shown her throughout the ordeal. He had not treated her as a victim, but as a person of strength and intelligence, capable of guiding her own destiny with support. They spoke little that night, but the conversation they did have was meaningful. Caleb asked about her experiences, her family, and her people. Nayeli shared cautiously, aware of the newness of trust, but appreciating the gentle curiosity he showed. Each word, each exchange reinforced a sense of partnership and mutual respect. They both understood that survival had brought them together, but trust and understanding would allow them to move forward. As darkness deepened, Nayeli thought about her future. She could choose many paths: return to her people, find a place to live safely among allies, or continue traveling with Caleb as a companion and protector. Each option was daunting in its own way, yet each also represented possibility. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she realized that she was no longer entirely at the mercy of others. She could shape her destiny, using the lessons she had learned from hardship, courage, and careful observation. Caleb remained vigilant, ensuring their temporary campsite was safe. Yet even as he maintained his watch, he felt a sense of satisfaction and pride. The escape had been risky, and the auction had tested both their wits and courage, but it had succeeded. Nayeli's poise, bravery, and intelligence had been as crucial as his guidance. Together they had navigated a dangerous situation and emerged stronger. He recognized that the world could be harsh and unforgiving, but moments like these showed the power of courage, compassion, and thoughtful action. The first light of dawn brought a golden glow across the plains, illuminating the path ahead. Nayeli awoke feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The night had offered rest, reflection, and a taste of safety, but the day would bring the challenge of moving forward. She stretched her sore muscles, feeling both the ache of the journey and the thrill of freedom. Caleb, already awake, handed her some water and offered a reassuring smile. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of trust, shared experience, and new beginnings. They mounted their horses once again, ready to continue the journey. The landscape stretched endlessly before them, rolling hills, groves of trees, and distant mountains. Every mile felt like a step away from fear and toward possibility. Nayeli's confidence grew with each movement. She felt capable, aware, and ready to face whatever challenges might arise. Caleb guided her carefully, offering support when needed, but allowing her to take the lead at times, reinforcing her agency and independence. Along the way, they encountered natural obstacles, narrow paths, streams to cross, and rocky terrain. Each challenge required focus, collaboration, and careful observation. Nayeli's skills, honed from years of surviving harsh environments, proved invaluable. She helped navigate the horses, identified safe paths, and remained alert to potential dangers. Caleb recognized her ability, appreciating not only her courage but also her resourcefulness. Together, they formed an effective team, moving steadily towards safety and a future filled with choices. As the day progressed, Nayeli's thoughts returned to the auction and the life she had nearly lost. She reflected on the cruelty of those who saw her as property and the resilience she had drawn from her own spirit. Yet she also reflected on the moments of hope, the subtle signals from Caleb, the fleeting openings in the crowd, and her own readiness to act. Each had been crucial in transforming despair into possibility. She realized that courage was not simply about strength. It was about timing, observation, patience, and action. Caleb, observing her reflection and determination, felt admiration and respect. He recognized that her courage had carried them as much as his guidance had. She had faced fear, humiliation, and uncertainty with unwavering resolve. He understood that true strength was not just in action, but in the ability to remain composed, think clearly, and act decisively under pressure. Nayeli's presence reminded him that courage often came in quiet, resilient forms rather than dramatic gestures. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the plains, they reached a small, safe settlement where allies of Caleb could offer shelter. The place was simple but secure, with a few cabins and a protective fence. Nayeli felt an immediate sense of relief. The threat of the auction and the danger of the town were far behind them. For the first time in days, or perhaps weeks, she could rest fully, knowing that she was safe. Inside the settlement, Nayeli met people who treated her with kindness and respect. They offered food, clean water, and a safe place to sleep. She realized that she had not only escaped the auction, but had also found a community that valued her as a person. The experience of being treated with dignity after having been treated as property was profoundly moving. Nayeli allowed herself to feel gratitude and relief, emotions that had been absent for far too long. Over the following days, Nayeli began to regain her strength, both physically and emotionally. She explored the settlement, learning its paths, meeting its residents, and discovering resources that would help her rebuild her life. She shared stories cautiously, recounting her experiences while reflecting on the lessons learned. She understood that survival required more than courage. It required awareness, adaptability, and trust in those who deserved it. Caleb remained nearby, offering guidance without intruding, reinforcing her sense of independence. Nayeli also began to reflect on the relationship she had formed with Caleb. He had not merely saved her, he had shown her respect, guidance, and understanding. He had acted with intelligence and courage, but he had also recognized her own strength and capacity for action. She realized that this partnership, born in a moment of crisis, could shape the next chapter of her life. It was a reminder that courage and compassion, combined with respect for others, could truly change a person's fate. Weeks passed, and Nayeli grew stronger, more confident, and more self-assured. The memory of the auction remained vivid, a reminder of danger and human cruelty. But it no longer dominated her thoughts. She had reclaimed agency, safety, and dignity. She understood that her life was no longer dictated by the whims of strangers, but by her own choices, guided by insight, courage, and thoughtful alliances. Caleb and Nayeli began planning the next steps together. Whether she chose to remain with him temporarily or return to her people, she now had the power to decide. The journey had transformed her, revealing her resilience, courage, and ability to navigate perilous situations with intelligence and composure. The story of that day, the auction, the negotiation, the escape, and the journey to safety, became a source of strength and wisdom for both of them. At night, as they sat together near the stream outside the settlement, Nayeli looked up at the stars and reflected on how far she had come. From fear, humiliation, and uncertainty, she had emerged into safety, dignity, and possibility. She realized that the world could be cruel, but it could also be kind, generous, and full of opportunity. Courage, both her own and Caleb's, had been the bridge between despair and hope. Caleb, noticing her thoughtful expression, spoke quietly. "You have shown strength beyond measure. Today, tomorrow, and every day forward, you decide your path." Nayeli smiled faintly, recognizing the truth in his words. The journey had been dangerous, exhausting, and transformative, but it had also revealed the power of courage, resilience, and thoughtful action. She knew that whatever came next, she would face it with strength, dignity, and an unshakable belief in her own worth. The experience had changed both of them. Nayeli had reclaimed her freedom and discovered her own strength, while Caleb had witnessed courage and resilience in a way that inspired him deeply. Their paths had crossed at the moment of danger, but their shared journey became a testament to human dignity, trust, and the profound impact one person's courage can have on another. As the settlement settled into quiet night, Nayeli and Caleb sat side by side, reflecting on the day, the escape, and the journey that had brought them here. The auction and its cruel beginning seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by the promise of safety, choice, and a future shaped by their courage and careful actions. In the quiet of the night, a sense of peace settled over them, marking the end of one chapter and the hopeful beginning of another.